One course. We have 3 minutes. Okay, right? Yeah. I really like
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone. Are we on? Almost there? We're there. Okay. So thanks to the duo of Jacob Dvorak and Sam Barnett. They just set the stage for the next episode of this SeminBar. And it's a pleasure for me to welcome Robert Waterman, who I've known for quite some time. And I figured I would try to briefly summarize why I thought it was appropriate to have somebody that's clearly not a hardcore scientist as we are used to having in this setting. So just to summarize very briefly, I would like just to try to outline for a non-scientific audience what is the effort that we have in Basel, the so-called National Competence Center in Research, and to try to explain it to lay people. I would like to take this example of two cult TV series of the 70s entitled The $6 Million Man and the Bionic Woman. And these were people that had an accident and they were essentially rebuilt with artificial pieces that are commonly referred to as prosthesis. And so this is the 1970-something vision of what such prosthesis could do to improve the quality of life. And arguably this is perhaps the best description of what this NCCR molecular systems engineering is doing. So if you look at the first ever discovered prosthesis is this wooden toe that was discovered and analyzed at the University of Basel, and this is 1000 before Christ. And now in 2016 we're up to the stage where we can actually engineer molecular systems and inject them in a patient to regulate the insulin level, for example. Alternatively, we're using virus therapy to restore vision in people that have gone blind. And this is the type of what we call either molecular or cellular prosthesis. And if you start thinking about, what are the ethical implications of doing such things, I'd like to take just another recent addition to the NCCR. And these are so-called organoids. So you can, starting from a stem cell, grow part of a brain. And then if you take this human brain and put it in a mouse, you can start asking yourself the question, when does consciousness arise? And, is this mouse partly human or not? And so this brings me to the next question is, what is consciousness? Does consciousness influence the experimentator? Namely, if you have let's call it a higher level of consciousness, does that influence the way you perform catalysis or experiments in general? And these are things that we as scientists are daily confronted to. So again, the key question, and it's something dating back to the alchemy, is how does the person carrying out the experiment influence the outcome of the experiment? So if you're sitting at a bench and you have to decide, I'm going to add 2 or 2.5 milliliters of this solution to this reaction, this might have an on-off outcome. And again, people can call this intuition, whatever you want to call it. There is clearly an influence of the person carrying out the experiment. And again, I've been brought to believe that the level of consciousness has a direct influence on the way you perform research and you live your daily life. So this is why I thought it would be interesting to have Robert Waterman here, and this is just a summary of what the NCCR has achieved. I don't think it's really very necessary to summarize this, but it's really a pleasure to have Robert Waterman, who I've known for close to 20 years, and so he has been a teacher for me in meditating, and he every now and then comes with a question that basically blows me off my seat, and I thought I would be interested in sharing this with some people that really believe that meditation and just the change in consciousness that you can achieve by various means, be it meditating, singing, running, taking LSD, whatever suits you. But at the end of the day, I think that maybe meditation is the best means to achieve these modified levels of awareness and consciousness. So just to summarize, Robert Waterman, he has a master's degree in sociology and a PhD in education and counseling. And since he could not quite fit the box, he decided to found his own university. So he founded the Southwestern College in the 70s, and in the meantime they actually offer PhD programs. And one thing that he has established is a master's degree in transformative leadership. And I wish many of our leaders would follow this type of advice. Can you transform the people, your co-workers, into being better scientists or better politicians or whatever? So again, he has multiple facets. He's a licensed mental health counselor, and he will, it's an experiment tonight just to see how he can influence the way we perceive consciousness and how this can influence our science. So one thing I would like to emphasize is that he likes speaking to an audience that is quiet. So if you have anything to say, wait until the question period. If you're unhappy, I suggest you leave the room. And what else should I say, I guess? Let me see. Yeah, there will be a workshop for anybody who really feels, convinced or interested by further discussing these opportunities. There's a workshop tomorrow morning, and there will be a sign-up sheet right there. And if you lose track of what he's saying, I suggest you watch his hands. Somehow when I listen to what he says and you start watching his hands, to me it seems like he's actually performing chemistry. He's transferring stuff from one flask to another, stirring, pulling things out. It's really quite fascinating. So in any case, without further ado, let's welcome Robert Waterman. Thank you very much.
So when Dr. Ward first proposed this idea for me to talk to this group, it was quite daunting. It never occurred to me to even think about that in a way. So it's like we get in our little silos to work. And I've been in a different silo than probably most of the people in this room for some time. In my silo, the laboratory is inside. It's internal. And so I've been spending a lot of time in there. And what I discovered was that some of the best terminology for talking about some of the things I was experiencing and discovering were in one of the other silos, which is the scientific, the material science silo. Just as Ward was introducing the talk, some of the things he's talking about are just right on the edge. This is a very exciting, for those of you who work here, this is a very exciting place to work. You're very fortunate, because it really is, you're asking some exciting questions. I think just to set the tone, I'm going to reread this quote that was in the description, just to set our perspective. Anyone who is seriously involved in the pursuit of science becomes convinced that a spirit is manifest in the laws of the universe, a spirit vastly superior to man, and one in the face of which we, with our own modest powers, must feel humble. So I'm humbled to be with you tonight, because it's a testament to the whatever that impulse or spirit is that powers your life, and carried you into this kind of inquisitive path to life, where you want to discover in the essence of things. And I would like to suggest in the beginning, and maybe again at the end, that every research we do and everything we explore, we're really discovering ourselves. In some way, it's a reflection back of you. So if we can open up a little more inside, we have an edge. When I was, I'd like to start out with my first big, powerful introduction to my own inner reality, because it oriented me to a particular way of looking at life. When I was 19, I was in a sensory deprivation experiment. That's where and I was in a little cubicle without any light or sound for 3 days. It was my first introduction to the scientific method, too. So they gave us these tests, these belief tests and conceptual tests and attitude tests before, and they gave us the same test afterwards. And what they were looking for was how much the sensory deprivation influenced your cognitive and emotional processes. Like, did you lose it? Did you come apart? Because they were looking for answers about how people were brainwashed in the Korean War. That does date me, of course. And as it turned out, it put me more together. So the setup was, they had this before-after measure. And in this room without any light or sound for 3 days. So it was, the room was kept at room temperature. The idea was to lose awareness of your body boundaries, among other things. And no light or sound. So it was a kind of deconstruction, because the normal operation of our life is pretty much out here in a visual world, reflective light, relating to other people, sound, noises, and we're so in with the physical body as the center of our reality. And so a lot of the thoughts and beliefs we're making up and things we're deciding are in relation to that body. Like, who am I? What do I look like? How do I appear? What gender am I? All these are reflective of being in this physical body. And so when you start deconstructing that, you start to loosen the matrix of your mind, in a sense. And so when that happens, something that's deeper within you can emerge. If you're prone to that. I think I was the only, in my group there were, I think 4 people, and I was the only one that stayed the 3 days. Other people, they couldn't take being with themselves that long, or they couldn't handle the scattering of their consciousness. At any rate, after about I think it was maybe a day or so, you lose track of time. Every shrill sound I ever heard went through my consciousness, and that was the only scary part, because it was very, fire engines, airplanes, whatever. And then it was really quiet. And in that quiet, in that stillness, the only thing you had to do was really be present with yourself. And pretty soon, after that first day, I'd find myself in another dimension where the objects and forms, light came out of them instead of reflected off of them. And the colors were incredible, far brighter and more vibrant and impressive than the colors of this dimension. And there were several layers of that reality where the forms were different, but they still had that quality of radiance or light coming out of things. And then every once in a while, I'd have an out-of-body experience where I'd fly over my neighborhood. I guess I was 19, I was homesick. So I'd fly home and check things out and come back. So that went on for, and it was pretty clear that it wasn't a dream, because it was just like this, except it was different. It was if all you were, if the room was dark and all you were just radiating lights, it would be more like that. And which says probably maybe more truth about us that, and they have started to measure, we do actually radiate light. Some people in some other silos are looking at that. So this had a pretty profound impact in the sense that, well, I have my physical life, and then there's this other dimension. And my experience was it was that we'll call it this fourth dimension, or that dimension I was in with the lights, contained this one. So it held or supported the physical body. And that it had to do with the rest of me. It had to do with my space. Had to do with that. So with that influence, I continued, went to the university, and spent half of my time with my academic studies and the other half the time with my spiritual studies to find out what was going on with that. And one of the things I discovered along the way was some of the metaphors and descriptions and discoveries that were going on in quantum physics and some of the material sciences actually were better metaphors or descriptions of what I was experiencing than some of the metaphysical descriptions. Recently I was reading some things about dark matter and dark energy, which I'll get to in more detail later, where this astrophysicist was discussing the nature of it, and that it was the larger portion of the energy and matter in our universe. And the reason it's dark is that it has no electrical charge. In other words, in the world of matter and reflected light, things have electrical charge. So you have chemistry, so you have structure, you have structural form. And so it's a certain kind of electromagnetic energy that knits together and holds this reality. Whereas with dark matter, this other energy, it's a different physics. It does have a physics. The way I experience it, it has a physics. And that, so with my experience in the sensory deprivation and some other things I'll mention later, it's clear to me that that dark matter somehow is similar to the darkness that lit up in my experience, and that it's another dimension, and it has a tangibility, and it has a different physics where light comes out of things, where light, it is light. It is, perhaps that's the physics of it. It's a different kind of photon. I just had the pleasure of meeting a gentleman named Ibn Alexander. And I'm mentioning these names because if anybody's interested, you can always Google them these days, and you find out stuff about them quickly. Anyway, he was a neurosurgeon. And a scientist, very renowned. And he'd built quite a career for himself in understanding neurobiology and being a neurosurgeon, and he really was into the perspective, as he relates it, to that the consciousness is an epiphenomena of the brain, and committed to that. So he became ill with meningitis, and it was a very severe case, and it took his brain down to like zero function. No way it could produce consciousness, just barely keeping him alive. And in the coma, he had these incredible experiences of these inner worlds. In fact, it was far more impressive than the experiences I had had. He went to different realms and levels. It was illuminated from within. And he found that in his traveling into it, it first started out very dense and then went to a lighter place. And that there was a sound that, there was music or a sound that went through it. I'm not sure it was jazz as we were listening to earlier, but it was a sound. And he found that if he paid attention to that sound, it would be a way to transport him to these different levels. And in his experience, it took him into finally a central place of consciousness. It seemed to just radiate this tremendously powerful love. And so at some point he came back. And this is not uncommon, I understand from near-death experiences, that whatever that consciousness is will actually come back, and then if heal or revive the physical body. So when he came back, he brought his consciousness back into the physical body. And it started to heal. And he came back and with just as much intellect and powerful understanding. He got his health back totally. He got his memory and his thinking back through this re-entering his body and reviving it. So it's quite spectacular. Consequently, he didn't return to neurosurgery. He changed to teaching about this and researching this, other near-death experiences, and creating ways to help people access this other dimension of themselves. So it was quite an experience being able to hear about his experience and being able to relate to it. There's a very interesting thing about what happens with the physical body when exposed to these other dimensions of energy. My experience was of this energy. It was an energy that permeated me and also held me and had a terrain to it, had structure, had consciousness. And by my focus, I could enter different places within these particular dimensions. So it had let's see if I can go find this guy's name. Yeah, Jim. Yeah, I read a article by Jim Beechler. He's calls himself a neurocosmologist. He's from the University of West Virginia. He's been looking at this, and from his model is that there's a place, in order to do research with this, in order to do science with this, material science, you have to have there's a crossover place where the consciousness I've been talking about and the consciousness of the physical body overlap, and he believes this is in the neural network. So it's by looking at the neural network. And so in his research, when somebody comes back from a near-death experience, it rewrites the neural network. Or when they have in meditation, experience of samadhi, it comes back and rewrites the neural network. So it enhances the consciousness in that way. So he even looks at it as an evolutionary process that's going on with that. One of my favorite physicists is David Bohm. He's kind of a philosopher too. I don't know and I ran into his material early on, and he's he's probably got one of the best comprehensions of the relationship of this inner dimensions and outer dimensions. He called it the implicate order and the explicate order. This one being explicate and the implicate being one that held this one. And that matter, or things that are physical matter, unfold from this background of energy. And so so he looks at causality as is not. He says no cause is local. So anything that happens physically, even us being in this room, each of us is a physical presence that unfolded from our consciousness. So we're very much into the brain as a epiphenomenon of consciousness perspective in looking at that. And from his perspective, the agency of the individual was the one that translated this. So it's somehow our consciousness. So when we go back to the Copenhagen, the double slit experiment, where they were looking at light as being wave or particle, depending on how you looked at it, started this whole thing of the observer effect. And so since then, we've been puzzling over all the ways that, what's the impact of the observer? You know, at the subatomic level, in quantum physics, it's pretty easy to see that it has an impact. But then out here, it's like, well, what do you mean I observe something and it just, can I make a truck show up or something? Well, that's the wrong question. Because in the complexity of our consciousness and the complexity of our group relationship, the observer thinks a bit more complex. We might ask, well, why does a prolonged demonstration change a government? Well, at some point there's a critical mass that enough observation is created to shift the consciousness, would be my explanation about that. So, so the implication of Beechler's work and Anderson and these people is that when we have a awakening or activation of this deeper dimension of ourselves, it changes our neural network. It changes how we're present physically. It changes how we look at things. So it's going to have a different impact on what we're doing in our research. So with that background, I would like to talk about my favorite prototypal example of a spiritual scientist. Just so by looking at his life and the things that he did, we can perhaps get an insight into what that would be like, what that internal structure could be like. So the individual I'm going to talk about is George Washington Carver. He's not as well known these days, but in the late 1800s and early 1900s, he was pretty well known. He was a black man in the south part of the United States in Alabama. And he was born before slavery had ended. And his parents died. And very unusual consciousness. He very early on sought out any education he could get. And when he was still a young person, he was meditating in a barn and had this experience where it seemed like, in his words, God overshadowed him. This presence came and stayed with him. So it introduced him to this side of his consciousness, with the spiritual part, the fourth dimensional part, or the fifth dimensional part. anchored into his physical nature. And so that's exciting enough, but what he did with that is pretty impressive. And by looking more carefully at the dynamics of his life and his psychology, we can pick up clues about how we might alter ourselves into a deeper and more powerful sensitivity of who we are in relationship to the universe we live in, the natural flow of things, and how we unfold and tap into the secrets that we're trying to find in our research. So he made, by doing laundry and washing clothes, he finally worked his way through the university and through graduate school, and took on a position at Tuskegee Institute, which was the first black college in the United States in Alabama, to set up their agriculture research department. While there, he was a very practical person. He would go around and teach people how to farm better so their crops turned out better and had better yields. But also, since quite young, he began to discover this ability to be so in tune with nature and with the loving that he called God that permeated all things, that he could be sensitive to, this plant does this remedy. And so he started working with that quite young. So as he gained in this technical side, this scientific side of himself and his academic training, he put the two together in an unusual way. He essentially would, I'll give an example. He got the farming thing worked so well that they had a glut of peanuts, and the farmers were going broke because they couldn't sell them. So this, being a scientist, he went over to the other side of this and, is there something else this peanut could do besides just be something you eat? I'm not going to look through my notes for the specifics on this, but so he went out and in his rapport with nature, in his connection to this higher consciousness, he went out and this is the way he describes it. He talked to the peanut and said, and what it was revealed to him by engaging, I do recommend you talk to your research. And through this consciousness, it was revealed to him that the purpose that the peanut was created for. So in nature, there's a purposefulness to everything. It all comes with some kind of gift or purpose or something to fulfill. So he went on to create all kinds of stuff out of the peanut, synthesized things from the peanut, plastics, fabric, just a lot of things in that process. And so he would take what the peanut said about what it was meant to do. He would take that inside information back to the laboratory and detail it out. In the laboratory, he'd experiment with his chemistry. He was a biochemist. And work out the products out of this peanut. Really, at that time, he was credited with saving the economy of the South because of he went to other things and synthesized them. So he, the way he would talk about it, he always carried a flower with him, and he said this was his way of tuning in. So it was a way of focusing mind, tuning in, and accessing this field of wisdom, or this field of knowledge that gave him insight about the essence or inner purposes of what what became material. In other words, what Bohm was talking about was in the implicate order in how that waveform would collapse and become, by observation, would become a physical form. So it's a very powerful version of the observer effect in a way. One thing Bohm talked about too is that his insight was that maybe we're looking at observing the photon through the experiment with the double slit, and it becomes a waveform or a particle. But his position was that to consider that perhaps the photon was also looking at us, looking at it, and just making decisions too. So it was a conversation. And so when we look at this example of Carver, we can see a demonstration. It very much was a conversation. His observation and the consciousness of the whole, or the consciousness of the nature, would be looking back at him. And through his focus of intent, they could have a kind of conversation. I don't know whether you actually heard it in words or heard it in impressions. I know my experience with things, it's more like a visual conversation. It's on a different level where through two consciousnesses, somehow we enter into the field of the whole, and there's a kind of synchronistic or simultaneous thinking going on, where we might not even notice that we're having a conversation in this higher consciousness, except that that particular time we felt very good when we were done with the conversation. So there's maybe three or four keys to Carver's ability to I thought I wasn't going to have material for the time, but I'm running along the way here. There were four key skills to what he was doing. The first one was love. So from his perspective, the universe, and from this work on dark matter I was talking about, Beechler believed that dark energy was reflecting this a love that permeates everything. And in my experience, that's the ground frequency, is this unconditional loving. Different than conditional loving. So it's kind of interesting, in this world of reflected light, we have conditional loving. And that's being held in a field of unconditional loving. And when you see what goes on, it would have to be unconditional, because the thing wouldn't hold together, because there's all this conflict. So it would have to be unconditional. If the essence, love itself, were conditional, we'd have a lot different story going on. So it was a kind of, so his love was a purity, where he was so infused in his being with this universal consciousness he called God. And the way he understood love was that when you love anything enough, it's going to give you its secrets. In other words, love it enough will tell you its secrets. And he not only just a plant, but people. He even gave the example of, a criminal. If you love him enough, or her enough, that person will reveal their secrets. Of course, being in the therapeutic world, this demonstrates itself all the time, because we're really teaching our practitioners to be present and unconditional loving, and so present that they don't have a projection on the person. And in that, they just see what they notice, because things start getting revealed. Just like when you're talking to a friend that's loving and unconditional and supportive, you'll talk about things you wouldn't talk to anybody else, because it's conditional. So in a sense, you cross that line between a third dimensional consciousness and a fourth dimensional one when you speak with your friend with unconditional love. I will give an example of that. I was, which is in graduate school, a friend of mine were in our doctoral programs together, and we tell what we call war stories, or character building experiences that we would have. Usually that was girlfriends who dumped us. That was the character building experience. And this was what we were talking about that night. So I was talking about this woman I was engaged to a few years earlier that dumped me. And it hurt a lot, like deeply, and that's the way conditional love is. And so there's this, what I call a personal field around us, where all the beliefs and stuff you have are kind of around you. If you ever wonder where that stuff goes in the unconscious mind, it's you're looking at life through it, and it's informing you about what life is. So it comes between you and reality on the other side. So when we talk about the observer effect, we have a lot of work to do in order to get a clear effect. So anyway, I was telling him this about this experience, and at the time we were studying out of school at this place where we were doing a kind of energy therapy, where we were becoming more aware, I guess training our neural net, according to Biesler, to have a different sensitivity to life. And so I remember very clearly in my attention, I would go in, and if you ever watch someone's eye movement, or how they look when they're thinking, you can tell where their memory is, or what they're accessing, and where they stored something. But anyway, I went out here, and when I touched this memory of this trauma, there was this explosion inside my body, and this ecstatic state just welled up through me and took me into an altered consciousness. Now when I think of that person, the love wells up instead of the pain. So that was quite impactful. So that's the kind of love we're talking about with Carver. The other, in Buddhism, they would call these skillful means. The Buddhists look at it like skillful means when something works well, and when something goes awry, that's an unskillful means. So the other one was expectancy. And what he meant by that was awe and wonder. There was always this expectancy when he would notice or look at something, that spirit would come back through, that the love would come out of that person, that they would see the light of them, the radiance of them. So in a sense, he was looking at people and things in the physical world the same way I was looking at things and objects in that altered world I was in, where light came out of things. It was the same kind of awe. So he would look at people in the physical world that way. So for him, those two dimensions were overlapping, where he was seeing both. So he called it expectancy. And the other pillar, and this is maybe a tough one for us sometimes, is humility, because we get into our fear and defensiveness and self-importance and entitlement, and cut off our consciousness. So by humility, he was relaxed. He was when he engaged his experiment, whether it was out in the field where he meditated every day, or in his laboratory where he was working with chemistry, there'd be this humility where it would be like a worship. He was present with something divine, even in the chemistry, or he's before present something with divine, and you're talking to the flowers, both sides. He had that kind of humility where he put himself equal to everything. And what that meant was equal to the most humble humanity, equal in his life, lived very humbly. But he was also equal to the spirit of love that was in everything. So I think I'm going to just go to this one more area and then see how we're doing, because it's a pretty full plate here. George Washington Carver this was his take on creation. He said there was four, that God gave us four domains. Well, whether nature does that or God does that, whoever it is, isn't important here. The important thing is that we're given this by the whatever intelligence that, whatever law that Einstein was talking about was guiding life. Came from this. So there's these domains. One was animal, which vegetable and mineral. We're aware of that. But the fourth one, he said, when I read it, was quite amazing. He said the fourth domain was synthetic. And that's where we land here today, in that what science is endeavoring to do is on this frontier of the synthetic. So where, like Dr. Ward was talking about, you can put this consciousness inside of a cell, and it's like a prosthetic. In which that's a synthetic process, or changing basic carbon into food, or these kinds of things. It's a synthesizing process. So synthesizing is not making up something separate from nature. Synthesis that Carver was talking about from his place of enlightenment was synthesizing something out of nature that nature hadn't created yet. So in a very real way, each of us is an agency of creation. We're an agency of nature. And part of our agency is to discover the essence of creation, and out of that make new things. This is a natural process. Organisms for billions of years have been running into challenges, obstacles, extinction events, and starting to look out for another way of doing things and synthesizing the next step. So what makes it different now in our kind of consciousness and the things that are happening in our world to change our neural net, some we're doing ourselves and some are done by nature, that's our business. So there's this, from my perspective, the spiritual leaders of the New Age are scientists, the awake scientists that have this, that have managed to discover this deeper relationship they have to the whole while they're doing their particular experimental work. So just to wrap it up here, there's just some practical things you can do instead of taking the whole leap. You don't have to get meningitis to be enlightened. That's a good news. You can learn, you can meditate. And there's simple ways. Take a little time out in the midst of your work to remember who you are and love yourself. Love your experiment. Talk to your experiment with the expectancy that it's going to answer you in some ways. And it may not answer in a way you're used to. It may come in a dream. It may occur to you talking to someone. Someone may say something that triggers you. But I guarantee if you start talking to your researcher and expect an answer, it's going to come to you somehow. And things are going to move a little more easily and a little more quickly for you in that. Another thing is that regard for your colleagues. I know when I get together with Dr. Ward, there's some kind of great thing that happens with our consciousness. It's like we become one consciousness, and I've got one silo and he's got the other one. And it's like my IQ goes up. And I can think about, I love talking to him to warm up for this because my IQ went up a few notches so I could think in these bigger terms. So there's a lot of little, the small things like this you can do. One thing that Bechler talked about was that there's a coherence, that when the brain coheres, that means it comes into a unity. He even talked about a neural net developing that brings the brain and the mind into unity. So he was talking about there's good science and bad science. said, really good science that's ethical and true to nature is well regarded, is free of the narrative that locks us in our silos so we can't think outside the box, free of all that stuff. So he said, you know, you can tell a good science because it has a quality to it that resonates the brain into this unity, into this coherence. So when you're doing your work and you're going down a path and it starts feeling really good inside, you know you're on the right track. Well, questions?
Thank you, Robert, for this enlightening discussion, for the perspective from your silo. I hope it has awakened some interest and some questions. So anybody would like to start?
Yeah.
Just today I read that the brain function between men and women are actually very different. And the kind that men use, I think, 7 times more of the gray matter than women, and women use 10 times more of the white matter. Do you know of any difference between, for example, near-death experiences between the two sexes?
No, I don't, but I can make stuff up. I'm very good at that. But so it's kind of basic. That's an incredible question. I know in my experience, something, as I continue in this, something happens in my neural net that my internal experiences of male and female start to disappear. And that's when the neural net changes, it affects our genetics, it affects our biology. And so there's an evolution going on here. So just as we notice that, oh, there's this change, there's a different expression, this is gender related. Well, a lot of people are experiencing genders that flow together these days. So something's going on in our evolution that's changing that. Now, as far as any near-death experiences I've looked into, everybody's so excited about they had this experience in another dimension, they bring it back and it changes their life. That they didn't look at the gender stuff, they're just so excited about that part. I haven't heard of that in near-death experiences that changes anybody's gender. But I've heard a lot about near-death experiences that changes their attitude towards the gender and creates a relationship where the two genders talk to each other more creatively. So it breaks down the entitlement, the dominance, all that politics that goes on. So one thing that disappears is the gender politics with near-death experiences. So I find that exciting.
Question?
Yeah.
Yes. Has near-death experiences something to do with dimethyltryptamine?
Could you start over, please?
Yes, I'm here. Does near-death experiences have something to do with endogenous dimethyltryptamine in our brain? Have you heard about that?
You may be talking about something I know nothing about. What did he say?
He's talking about, chemistry, basically. Does this molecule called dimethyltryptamine have an influence on near-death experiences?
I don't know what that is, but I know that a near-death experience changes the neural network, and so it's bound to change the chemistry. So what is that drug supposed to do, that chemical? What's it do?
Yes, I don't know much either, but I've just heard that...
So we got two dummies talking to each other about something. We'll just have to work it out together. Thanks. You got a follow-up for that? We just hit the humility part. We just did the humility. Thanks.
Next question.
Somebody down here.
in a society where probably spiritual scientists are a little bit of a minority, how do you cope with a lot of rejection of your beliefs by the scientific community?
Could you get that?
With rejection from people that don't believe that there's a connection between spirituality and science?
Actually, I don't notice it. But that's a exciting question, because we are kind of controlled by how people see us or the criticism. So somebody in a depending on which silo you're working in, you could be working in a silo where you're the one person that believes that the brain is an epigenetic phenomenon of consciousness, and everybody else believes the other, that the brain came out of the consciousness came out of the brain. And so, and you have all these people are very ambitious and very excited about their intellects and their mental power. You might be in a deadly situation if you were that person. I've been doing this a long time, and I'm just loving the attitude in this room. It's pretty good, actually, in comparison. So most scientists in here are the curious kind. That at least see me as some kind of strange phenomena that they've aroused with curiosity about. So not so mean. But there's a thing that happens is there's a changeover between when we live in our ego, we're kind of fear-based, and we're trying to protect the ego. And that's how we define ourselves, and we define ourselves by what reflects back to us. As we deepen inside, we start accessing our soul. And our soul works very differently. It's in that field of unconditional love. It's a different kind of way to source how we see and how we experience ourselves. So this is a psychological health process. So you move to a basis where you organize your reality on a love basis. Well, the more you migrate into that, the more resilient you are. And it's more like you become like, in terms of vicious attacks, you become like a bucket of water. You can try this. You take a bucket of water and then sock it. Stick your fist in as hard as you can. And then when you pull it out, the water goes back just like it was. See, so it's a different frequency. The only way it can affect you is if you decide, if you take it personally. See, so we're back to one of Carver's points about expectancy, where you're always looking at people in terms of the loving that is their essence. So another way to deal with that kind of energy is you're present in a loving way. And there's something about being present with what is without projecting a bunch of stuff on it that gives you an unusual awareness. And you just meet people with this expectancy. And when you take it personally, you polarize and start fighting with them, and usually you lose. But if you take that and start getting interested in where they're coming from and what they have to say and what their contribution of their viewpoint, even though said hostilely, it changes it. There's a unity starts to happen that eventually, through that kind of dialogue, you're going to be able to meet them. So those are a few of the things, in case you run into that.
Further questions? One in the back.
Hi there. I just wanted to ask a question from the perspective of an artist and a musician.
A what? Oh.
So, as musicians, I've experienced a high conscious a state of high consciousness from performing and having really interactive performances and sessions with other musicians that I really love to interact with in that sense. And it's a universal language. And I wanted to ask you, do you work with a lot of creative people, artists? Do you see it as another side of science? And do you, I don't know, is it calculable, their experience with music or art? And do you do any research on that?
I didn't get the question part.
I just wanted, sorry, I'll make it simpler. I just wanted to ask if you work with a lot of creative people and artists, and if their experience have informed you in any way.
Oh yeah, there's a lot. It's just amazing what's going on. There's the music we're introduced with here, which is very relaxing, and people start letting go, and they start to ride the music, and it starts affecting them inside, where they start to integrate and balance and let go of the day, and that's very powerful healing. So we go from there to kinds of music that actually resonate with deeper levels of consciousness. On the other side, that's on the reflective light side. On the radiant light side, there's also radiant music. So actually, someday we'll discover this. It's actually music that creates the universe from an internal sense. So it's what mystics call the sound current, or there's meditations called Shabda Yoga, or they tend to the sound current. And I talked a little bit about even Alexander's experience, where he heard a music that he described as a music. By tuning to it, he can ride up through the levels. So that's internal and radiant. Then there's reflected music. Well, those resonate. So the highs come when those two are resonating, when you're doing music. I had a client, in fact, you reminded me of a client I had a couple of months ago, who was a trumpet player, and he was having a lot of emotional situations, and so I asked him in his trumpet playing, did he have a God note? And you had talked to a trumpet player, they have this God note, and maybe others do too. So he said, yeah, I do. He said, well, you need to meditate. Why don't you imagine, like here in your head, that God note, and just hold to it and write it out. See? So we get to look at all kinds of things like that. So I can appreciate your experience, and yeah, this is good stuff. And they're also working with just sound tones, where it's a kind of music where it's like one side's a little offbeat from the other, and what it does is it resonates the brain by listening to the thing in both ears. And sometimes classical music will do that. You can listen to it in both ears, and it creates that brain coherence I was talking about, and a coherence with the heart, and which then in that state, it's very easy to access the fourth and fifth dimensions of things.
Thank you.
So that's all I know about it. Sorry.
Just on the anecdote side, I sometimes send weird emails to my group claiming that drawing molecules can be highly meditative. So I would argue, I'm sure that composing or playing music brings you to a much higher level than just drawing molecules.
Oh, that was another thing. I was talking to Dr. Ward earlier. I said, we were talking about researchers and how you could tell if they were having this coherent brain experience. I said, well, if they're doing their research and they start whistling or singing, they probably got it. Because they're reflecting that inner experience.
So I've been in research for a few years now, and I need to admit that I've never done meditation, pure meditation myself, and something that I've observed is that when I'm in the office trying hard to get the best ideas I can get, I never succeed. But then I go to sleep, take one of these Spanish long naps, or go jogging or swimming, whatever, and then just my brain pops up with this greatest idea for that specific project. And this has happened a few times already. And I was wondering, like, why would we have the best ideas when you are actually trying not to think about your work?
If I understood you correctly, you're struggling with your work, and then you go away and you go to sleep or you meditate, and then the idea comes. Yeah, see, that's a natural process. It's if we want to, it's a little bit like, I don't know if they have them here, but there's an image I get. When I was little, they had in these in these stores in America, they had these tubes, and then they would put this thing in a little cartridge, and some banks use it, and send this tube up, and the cashier sends the thing back. So the way I started looking at that is the struggling part is building energy. It's like taking the basic self, the physical chi and energy, and it's building up on your question. And it feels like tension and frustration, because it is. And then you just let it go. And you go do something else or meditate or go to sleep. And so it goes out. And so somebody's listening. Something's listening. And so when you're receptive in that humility state, that humble state, you get the answer download. It's a natural thing.
I have a short follow-up question. For the ones that we have the boss in the room, does this mean that we should take more holidays in general?
That was really good, but I missed it.
More holidays.
Yes, little ones. In fact, a lot of little holidays. You know, every hour, take a holiday. So how are we doing? See, since we're having dinner tonight, I looked at this talk like an hors d'oeuvre. So this was the appetizer, and hopefully it creates an appetite.
For tomorrow, you mean, or for the workshop,
No.
or just in general?
Well, that too. That's the second course. One other image that's in my head that I had to share was that I started out with these silos, and it seems rather stark, all these silos where people aren't talking with each other. But I think there's a plot to it. So don't worry too much about if you're in a silo, because in the evolution of this, each silo is working on a specific issue or problem that needs to be solved. And at some point, as we respond to our evolution, all the silos are going to come together and have the whole picture. So enjoy and anticipate, have expectancy, be humble, love your colleagues, love your work, talk to your experiments. Expect an answer.
Thank you very much. Dinner? Thank you. Thanks. It's been spectacular.
We got through it. I had way too much material.